Just waiting. Okay, we're recording again. So we talked about a little bit about faith, a little bit about collectivism. Now the next one, yeah, it's a bit tricky because we're not all Confucian scholars. You know, I've lived in China several years. I've read about Confucius and the Analects, and I feel like I have a basic idea, but I definitely wouldn't consider myself an expert. Um, but there is a lot of information about him online, and I've never found him that interesting. I think the Western philosophers, whether it's Plato or Nietzsche, are a lot more interesting and thought provoking than Confucius. But yeah, if somebody wants to understand China, Chinese culture, it's necessary to I think have some familiarity with Confucius because he is such an important part of the culture. What do you know about Confucianism? What is your ideas about it? What do you know about it? Again, how do you think it manifests or influences the culture or the education? What's your take?
Well, I guess I've visited my first really exposure to Confucius was in Vietnam. I saw that there was a Confucius school, or the first Confucius school. I'm not sure what the significant was, um, but that got me to that inspired me to just kind of think about who this person was, and the only thing that I could really uh, drill down into is that he's very strong on authority. From what I know, I could be completely wrong on this. From what I understand, there is a hierarchy in place. It's very male driven, um, and it's either there's either like a right or wrong type mentality. From what I understand, I don't really I've never really looked into his teachings uh, or the details of Confucianism, but I do know that there is a widespread criticism about these Confucius schools that are popping up all over global universities,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
I would say that universities are uh, I would say a bedrock for debating ideas. They will allow some of the worst ideas to be discussed. So if they have an issue with Confucianism being taught in their schools, then that tells me that there is a problem with how data material analysis are being really transferred. Like I don't know too much about it, but I can't say that universities are just being anti-China. No, I don't think that that's the right way to
yeah.
describe the issue.
Well, you're referring, I think, to the Confucian Institutes, and I think Sweden was the first or one of the first to ban it. But I don't think it really has anything to do with Confucius or Confucianism. I think it's just more they look at it as Chinese propaganda and trying to portray a false image of China and Chinese history. Um, I think they would pay a lot of lip service to Confucius, but again, I kind of understand the rationale behind banning these because I think they're worried about it's because you could go to a university and take, most universities would have Chinese history courses or Eastern philosophy. So it's not like Confucianism is banned. I think it's just a lack of mistrust with, the CCP being involved in Western education because they tend to, I think, whitewash things a lot more. I think in America, again, for example, we love to air our dirty laundry and self-flagellate and talk about this. You know what I mean? Talk about the sins of our past and just roll around and wallow in every. Like it's almost like again opposite. I believe that in America, a lot of people we really underemphasize all our achievements. I mean, we're like the first country to go to the moon, and if I'm
Right,
not
right.
mistaken,
We are
you
humble
know
in
what?
some ways.
Yeah, and we don't, and we have the most Olympic medals. I think, like in history, we usually come out, and a lot of us, we don't take any pride in that, or we just ignore that, or just go, yeah, that's nice, but let's talk about all the bad thing. And like, we love that. We love this hyper criticism. But again, in China, it's like, no, we've never done anything wrong. Like, we're awesome.
I would like to add it. Yeah, I would like to add an anecdote to that. One of the parents of my students, I've become good friends with him, and they wanted to purchase a book about the war between China and Taiwan, or whatever that situation whatever happened. There was a special book that's not sold in China mainland, but is sold in Taiwan. So they gave me the great task of going and purchasing that book and bringing it back to them. And they understand that they do kind of, like you say, whitewash things, but it's almost like they don't want to they don't want to put value in it. Like for us, if someone tries to whitewash history, we raise the most noise about it. We really do take value about truth and
Truth.
honesty. This is what we try to do, but it seems like, yeah, Chinese culture, it's just
It's
more like
image, it's reputation.
right.
And again, this reminds me again of another old saying I grew up with as a kid. Don't judge a book by its cover. Appearances can be deceiving. It's what's on the inside that counts. We have all these little phrases and expressions, and I feel like in China it's the opposite. It's like, no. It is about the cover of the book. It's not about the content. If it's a beautiful golden cover, and it makes you look smart, that's all that matters. And truth is really just not given a lot of priority in China, in my opinion. And again, I think this is another sort of difference, just maybe in like their philosophies. Again, with Confucius, whenever I've read about him or studied him, he seemed like a very practical philosopher. Like, he was very grounded, I think, in like the material world and relationships and society and, yeah, authority, hierarchy, and just how can we have a harmonious society. Whereas I think, again, in
Mhm.
the West, you look at Socrates or Plato or like some of these ancient philosophers, and there is a lot of questioning about, well, more abstract. What is truth? What is virtue? What is knowledge? Epistemology. How do we know if something is true? What does it mean to be good? And I feel like with the West, there's a lot more sort of abstract, metaphysical thinking. And I feel like in China, again, it's a lot more just practical.
Well,
And truth. Yeah, go ahead.
I don't think that they really recognized the Age of Enlightenment either. I think their studies come from such a long time ago that they just don't really take part into what the world has discovered throughout time. This is what I think.
Okay. So maybe that would be like a difference in education. Maybe.
Well, no, I think you were hitting on all the points where it is, some of it is kind of metaphysical. Like I say, a lot of it does have to do with epistemology and a lot of the Greek philosophers that really brought the thought process into the Enlightenment period, where we really saw a lot of advancement through society, where we actually put pen to paper instead of just kind of letting it go through the wheelhouse, or I don't know how to explain it. But yeah, I think you're completely right on all that.
Okay, great. So now we've talked about some of the maybe more broad cultural themes: faith, collectivism, Confucianism. So now I want to get more into maybe the more practical side, the more day to day, what's it like to be a teacher type stuff. So we've looked a little bit, discussed a little bit about the culture. Now let's talk about stuff that might be, well, hopefully all that's useful for potential teachers coming to China, but I want to get into some more, yeah, very, very practical things. So the next question I want to ask you is, what would you say, I think, talked about this a little bit earlier, but maybe you have something else to add. But what were some obstacles that you encountered, maybe not just as a person in China, but maybe specifically as a teacher, like in the sense of working in education? What were some obstacles that you encountered, and how do you think you might have overcome them?
Well, I've learned to stay in my own lane. So I guess I've seen a lot of their behavioral the way they handle behavior with children. I can't really say too much about how they teach, what their learning process is like, because I work at an international school, and we do teach with an international curriculum. Now we are still kind of in the learning stages of everything. I do think that it's more of, or it was, uh, just a give and take type relationship between the teachers and students, where the teacher would give, the students would take. But now our curriculum is more of inquiry based, where we want to build life learner lessons with children, having them find the answers on their own, having them ask questions, being able
Oh, wow.
to really develop the skills for them to be leaders in some respects. So the one thing that I did notice is I went to it was a training center, but for middle school, and they were teaching English, and I just kind of sat in the back and watched, and I would say the majority of it was taught in Chinese, but it was like the teacher would call on a student, the student would stand at attention, they would give them the answer and bow to the teacher and sit down. There was no kind of additional information given, no kind of character being
Right.
expressed, no delivery, no creativity involved, uh, and it seemed like whatever that teacher says, it was 100% abided by all of the students. Now I saw another class within the same training center taught by a foreigner, and was completely different, where people were having fun, and there was a lot of laughter, and you could tell that there was a lot more expression being involved, a lot of vocal expression. So I think that I think the more traditional the more traditional educational uh, strategies are definitely authority based, versus in my class, where I allow students to have free expression as long as it's not too disruptive. Uh, and one metric that I used was I noticed that there were two people arguing with each other, and it was a pretty heated debate. And this is kindergarten, so
Okay.
uh,
Wow. They were actually debating. That's good.
right, and they were using a great deal of English in this little debate, and I was like, wow, like I could not believe it. Now these two children, they were very very smart, top of the class. So I wouldn't say that they represent all of the students in the class, but still being able to watch them use English, arguing with each other, debating each other. I just sat back, I watched it, I stopped the class, and we all just enjoyed the moment. So and this is what students, in my opinion, really do need to learn, is they need to learn how to communicate their emotions effectively, and with the intentions of having positive outcomes. So
Yeah.
I think that this was a good example of that I've been doing things in the right way, because I'm also learning as well. And I know that every class has their own characteristic, but things were very special during this moment. So I would say that there's a huge difference between how Chinese teachers teach and versus foreigners teach.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, I just want to get on the record real quick. So, you've been at the same school. This is your third year. So, do you mostly teach kindergarten, or do you teach different ages, or which age group or groups do you mostly work with?
No, I only teach kindergarten, but from time to time, maybe a friend will tell me to come to their training center, or whatever. Not to teach, but just to be there. Like you say, it's all about face and image and stuff like that. So for them to have a foreigner at a English training school would really legitimize their venture. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, the next question, I think you kind of just answered at least partially. Maybe you have something else to say, maybe not. If not, we can move on. But the next question I have is, what do you believe are some of the major differences between a typical Chinese classroom and a Western classroom? Now, you just kind of gave some examples, but can you think of any more? Are there anything else that comes to mind about what do you think are some of the differences, or do you think you pretty much covered it?
Well, I would say that from what from the little bit that I've seen in like public schools and stuff, uh, it doesn't seem like it's too thought provoking for students. It doesn't seem like they're there to stimulate the student's mind
Right.
versus every public school in our country, they have everything in their room that really supports the education that's being taught. And I think that this is so important. Like, I don't think education can be learned from just books and that's it. There has to be, I guess the word would be kinesthetic learning, where it can be hands-on through experiences. The learning process can be done in so many different ways. Um, but one thing that I can add on is uh, the university education. I
Oh
was
gosh.
completely shocked. Uh, yeah, you know where I'm going.
Maybe.
I can't believe how they fall flat with university education. I will say that sure, students will bust hard to get to that university, but once they're there, it's almost like they don't care. It's almost like the 40%, or I should say the 60% dropout rate. I'm not sure what year that study was. The 60% dropout rate of our universities, where students they just want to party, enjoy themselves. It's kind of like the same type of mindset with all Chinese university students. That's the way it seems to me. I'm sure that there are universities out there that really do push for grades and having students produce things, but from my understanding, from all over, it seems that universities uh, they don't really care about how a student actually performs. They are really stuck on that image of having that 99% graduation rate.
And again,
Uh,
that's like face. I think part of it's probably financial as well, but yeah, again, it's all about I think reputation and face. And we have a high graduation rate, and we have this many foreign teachers, and we have this many PhDs, and etc.
Right, and I always tell people like, well, even so with I've seen examples with foreigners that come here, and they're students, they're registered as students, but they live in other cities and teach, and I'm like, how do you do this, man? Like, how can you get away with not going to class, take exams, doing this, doing that, doing internships, and you're not even there? Well, they say I just pay someone to sit in for me. This is something that no university in our country could ever allow. No one could ever get away with that in our country. I believe. I don't want to say that we're too high in that regard, but I think that the way our education system is, everyone really does have to prove themselves.
Yeah.
And if someone doesn't if someone doesn't has a separate identification card or something like that, or they see a new face on test day, yeah, they're going to say they're going to notice that. But I'm sure that it does happen from time to time. But it seems here that it happens all the time. Like
Yeah.
there's really no concern whatsoever.
Yeah, and I think that might be one of the reasons why the ones who can afford to go abroad and go to university in the United States or Canada or Australia do, because I think our Western foreign degrees have more weight and more value than a Chinese degree for some of those reasons.
Yeah, I don't even understand why foreigners come here and go to school. Like, I mean, I guess I shouldn't sound too snark about that. Like, I do get it that there are international students from uh, underdeveloped countries, and they come here because China is a developing nation, and there are obvious benefits as to why they would get a degree in China versus their home country. I totally get that. But for someone coming from a developed Western country, I don't see how valuable. I don't know. This is something that I'm curious about. But uh, I just, like you say, I think the value lies with universities that do have the Socratic method as far as discussion and openness. This is what I believe.
Yeah. And now something else you said earlier, I think about like American classrooms want to stimulate the mind and critical thinking. Another difference in my mind between, again, a general difference between U.S. style education and China style, mainland China style education is it's almost sort of quality versus quantity. I think in the West we spend a lot of time thinking about academic theories and the quality of education and the education of the teacher, and is everybody being treated fairly, and people talk about equity, and so there's a lot of emphasis on I think substance and quality, whereas in China, I feel it's a lot more quantity. Like the more time you spend in school, the better. So you'll sometimes have students in class from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. And then on the weekends, they go to training schools for, it's just like it's almost like this, we have that saying in America, don't work harder, work smarter. And I think that's sort of
Right.
our approach. And I feel like in China, it's like, no, 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 no. Like, you only studied for 8 hours today, but if you study for 12 hours, that's 50% better. And that's the way they think of it. But I think in the West, we'd say, well, if you study for 12 hours, your brain's going to go off. You're going to be tired. You're not going to retain everything. And again, like, what if, and again, if you're just reading a book all day, that's quantity, but yeah, maybe you're not that. Maybe that's not the best or the only method. Anyway, I'm kind of rambling, but yeah, would you agree with that? They think in terms of
Yeah,
quantity.
absolutely. They definitely feel the more time being spent on subjects equates to how much knowledge a person can obtain, and okay, sure, they might have some kind of book smarts, but when it comes to common sense, real world application. I don't necessarily believe that a book is where you're going to find that information. Um, and that's why we have laboratories. That's why we really dissect things. Like I said, hands on. I think that these type of strategies are more useful than what the Chinese give credit for. Now, I'm sure that once when they go for their doctoral degree or whatever, they start to do their what's that? What is it called? Dissertation, whatever. Yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
yeah,
There's
yeah.
probably some hands-on style stuff there, but just from a general aspect of learning, I just think it all comes from a book, and I teach my landlord's son, and every time I go there, he is just he sits at his desk and he writes and he writes and he writes. I think it is the most boring life that a child could ever have. But that's what they have to do. And I've heard so many times where they say, "Oh, Justin, I really value how you can do what you want. You can make your own decisions. You don't have anyone dragging you down. You don't have any kind of obligations where you need to do this, you need to do that, simply just because." That they would say, just because that's the culture. So I know that there's a frustration amongst a group of people. I don't know if it's large or small or significant or not, but I know that there are people looking for change,
Good.
and I think they're going to keep looking.
Yeah, yeah, and we'll see what happens. I do think it's good that China is gradually opening up, although some might argue under President Xi they've been kind of taking a step backwards. But with the internet and again access to more American movies and entertainment, just more access and exposure. Now again, the internet is heavily censored in China, but there is more awareness now. Like for example, the first time I went to China was 2003, and the only Western movies that 99% of the Chinese people I talked to, the only movies they knew, foreign movies, were Forrest Gump and Titanic. And they could go to DVD shops and access other movies, but those were the two ones most people are familiar with. Whereas, I was in Beijing for a few years, not too long ago. And, I had students who I was working at a university and they watched like Friends, for example, the American sitcom. And some of them watched The Big Bang Theory, and a lot of them knew the Marvel movies. So again, there's been more of this, exposure to, just outside pop culture and media. And, a lot of students like maybe Justin Bieber, Taylor Swift, and I think that's good just for them to have that exposure to a bigger world than China.
Yeah, I definitely think when it comes to media consumption, they're really getting up with a lot of the American movies, TV shows, and stuff like that. And this really does help, like you say, have that exposure that there is life outside of what they're doing, how they think, and stuff like that. Uh, in this way, I think it does kind of stimulate their mind of what's going on outside of China. Uh, Even though it is kind of some of it can be hyperbolic or fictional, but at the same way, they can say, okay, this is kind of what life is like in the United States or whatever. Um, so in regards to the internet, it is heavily censored. Um, but I think that people don't really use, how can I say, Western's websites. I don't know if Western is the right word for that. Like if they use Microsoft Edge, Microsoft is accessible in China, and you can find comparable information. I know that it doesn't really have the same results as Google, but and that's just not going on the sites itself. You can kind of track a little bit of information, kind of like a brief overview of your keyword search. Now, of course, if you go to that certain website to really drill down into the details of it, you might have an arrow 404. But other than that, I think if they don't use Baidu, they use other web browsers that are accessible in China. Maybe they can really get the sense of everything. This is what I believe.
Yeah, that's a good point. I hadn't actually considered that, but yeah, that's a valid point. All right, let me stop here so I don't lose this, and then we'll continue and I think move on to the last section. So let me stop it right here.